Have you ever stopped to think that the chocolate bar you eat in just a few minutes took years to produce? And no, I'm not exaggerating down now. Think about it. What if I told you that it all starts on a tree, with a strange fruit, and a process that involves fermentation, extreme heat, and even natural chemical reactions? That's right, the chocolate you love goes through a much more complex journey than it seems. And there's more. Brazil, one of the world's largest cocoa producers, consumes less chocolate per person than countries like Switzerland, while their consumption reaches up to 12 kilos per person per year. Here, the average is around only 4 kilos. But the big question is, how exactly does that bitter, bland seed transform into something so delicious, creamy, and addictive? Stay with me until the end, because today you're going to discover the whole process behind chocolate making, from planting to the finished bar that reaches the shelves. And I guarantee you, after this video, you'll never look at chocolate the same way again. It all starts with a tree called the cacao tree, a plant typical of tropical regions, found mainly in Central and South America. It is from this tree that the main ingredient of everything comes, cocoa. But the most curious thing is that chocolate, as we know it today, wasn't always sweet. In fact, it started as a bitter drink. Back then, thousands of years ago, civilizations like the Mayans and Aztecs already used cocoa, but instead of bars or sweets, they made a thick, bitter drink considered sacred. Yes, sacred. Cocoa was so valuable that it was even used as currency in some cultures. Now imagine that. Something that you can easily buy in any market today was once a symbol of power, wealth, and even spirituality. But everything started to change when Europeans came into contact with cocoa, and that's when the history of chocolate took a complete turn. Now imagine the scene. The year is 1519. European explorers arrive on the American continent and encounter something completely different from anything they had ever seen before. Among so many discoveries, one stands out: a dark, frothy, bitter drink, but extremely valued by the local people. That's how cocoa caught the attention of the Spanish. When Hernan Cortes arrived in the Aztec Empire, he quickly realized that this was not something common. It was valuable. So valuable that he decided to take cocoa beans back to Europe. And this is where everything starts to change. Because, let's be honest, the Europeans tasted that bitter drink and didn't like it very much. But, instead of discarding the idea, they did something simple that changed everything. They added sugar, and then milk, and that's it. What was once a strong and bitter drink began to transform into something smoother, sweeter, and more pleasant. But something important was still missing: the texture. For a long time, chocolate was only consumed as a beverage. It wasn't until the 19th century that a revolution occurred. Someone had the idea of mixing cocoa powder, sugar, and cocoa butter, creating something solid. Yes, the first chocolate bar was born, and it didn't stop there. A few years later, a Swiss man named Daniel Peter decided to take it a step further. He added powdered milk to the mixture, and so milk chocolate was born. Creamier, smoother, and of course, much more popular. But here's an interesting detail. None of this would have been possible without another invention: powdered milk, created by Henry Nestle. It was essential in giving chocolate the texture we know today. Now think about it. A simple adjustment to the recipe completely transformed a food that was once bitter, ritualistic, and restricted into something global, accessible, and extremely desirable. But even with all this evolution, everything still depends on one thing: cocoa. And that's exactly where the most impressive part of this whole story begins. Because before it even reaches the factory, there's a long, manual process full of details that begins in the field. And believe me, it's much more complex than it seems. Now, let me take you to a completely different place. Heat, humidity, dense vegetation, the sounds of nature all around. It's here, in the tropical regions, that it all begins. The cacao tree is not just any tree. It needs very specific conditions to grow: a hot, humid, and stable climate. And even then, it doesn't bear fruit overnight. In fact, it can take 3 to 5 years for a tree to start producing cacao. Yes, years. And that already shows how much patience chocolate requires from the very beginning. Planting begins simply, but with extreme control. The seeds are placed in bags with rich, moist soil, where they are protected while they grow. When they reach about 30 centimeters, they are finally taken to the field. But there's another, even more interesting method: grafting. Basically, producers take a piece of a plant that already produces well and connect it to another already rooted one. This helps guarantee quality and productivity. Now, pay attention to this. Unlike most trees, the cacao tree has a curious behavior. The flowers don't grow on the tips of the branches. They grow directly on the trunk. That's right, directly on the trunk. This phenomenon even has a name. But the most important thing is to understand how different this plant is. And there's more. Not every flower becomes fruit, in fact. Most on single quotes T. Pollination depends on tiny insects, small, almost invisible flies. Without them, there simply is no cacao. Now imagine the level of delicacy of this process, an entire chain depending on small details of nature. When pollination happens, then the development of the fruit begins. And it's not fast. It takes between 5 and 7 months for the cocoa to be ready to be harvested. During this time, the fruit changes color, going from shades of green to yellow, orange, or even reddish, depending on the variety. And here comes another important point. Not all fruits ripen at the same time. That is, the harvest cannot be done haphazardly. It needs to be manual, careful. It requires attention. Workers use machetes, special shears, and even long tools to reach the highest fruits. And a crucial detail, the cut needs to be precise. If it damages the tree, it can compromise future harvests. Now think about this. Each fruit harvested there represents the beginning of something that, later on, can become that chocolate you eat without even imagining this whole story. But the most impressive part hasn't even begun yet. Because after the harvest comes one of the most important stages of the entire process, and also one of the most unknown. Fermentation. And this is where the true flavor of chocolate begins to emerge. Now pay close attention to this. Up to this point, the cocoa that has been harvested doesn't yet taste like chocolate. That's right. If you were to take a seed freshly removed from the fruit and taste it, the flavor would be completely different from what you imagined. So the question is, at what point does chocolate begin to emerge? The answer lies in a process that many people don't even imagine exists. Fermentation. Right after harvesting, the fruits are opened, usually with machetes or even by hitting the shell with pieces of wood. And from inside them come the seeds, covered by a white, moist, and slightly sweet pulp. And here comes an important detail. This pulp is not discarded. It is essential. The seeds, still surrounded by this pulp, are placed in wooden boxes, baskets, or even piles covered with banana leaves. And then, the transformation begins. In the first 24 to 48 hours, the so-called anaerobic phase occurs. That is, without the presence of oxygen. At this moment, natural yeasts begin to act. They consume the sugars in the pulp and transform everything into alcohol. Yes, alcohol. But hold on, this is just the beginning. After this phase, the process changes completely. Now oxygen enters, and with it, bacteria enter. During the next few days, the temperature inside the boxes can reach about 50 degrees Celsius. It's practically a natural oven. And this is where something decisive happens. The seed embryo dies. This prevents it from germinating, and releases chemical compounds that will give rise to the flavor of the chocolate. At the same time, bacteria transform the alcohol into acetic acid, which penetrates the seed and begins to develop the characteristic flavor that, later on, will become chocolate. Now think about this. Without this process, chocolate as we know it simply wouldn't exist. This is where it all truly begins. But it's not over yet. After fermentation, the seeds have a very high moisture level, and that's dangerous. It can generate mold, deterioration, total loss of the product. Then comes the next stage. Drying. The seeds are spread out in the sun or taken to greenhouses. They need to be stirred several times a day. This process can last from 7 to 14 days. Slow, careful, and extremely important. Only after that are the seeds ready to travel. They are stored in bags and sent to factories around the world. And that's where the transformation enters another level. The artisanal work of the field is gone, and industrial precision takes over. But I'm warning you, what happens inside the factories is as impressive as everything we've seen so far. Now imagine the scene. After all that process in the field, fermentation, drying, transport, the cocoa seeds finally arrive at the factories. And here everything changes. The natural environment is gone, and in its place comes a highly controlled, precise, and technological process. As soon as they arrive, the seeds go through the first stage, cleaning. It may seem simple, but it's essential. Machines remove stones, twigs, dust, and any impurities that may have come along during transport. Everything needs to be perfect. After that, the seeds are sorted, separated by size, quality, and characteristics. Because yes, Not all cocoa is the same. And this directly influences the final flavor of the chocolate. Now comes one of the most important steps of all. Roasting. The seeds are heated to temperatures ranging from 120 to 150 degrees. And this is where something incredible happens. The heat begins to develop the aromas and flavors of the chocolate. That unmistakable smell, that just smelling it makes your mouth water. This process can last from 30 to 50 minutes, depending on the type of cocoa. And in addition to intensifying the flavor, roasting also reduces the remaining moisture. But there's another important detail. After roasting, the seed shells become brittle, and this facilitates the next step, the cracking. The seeds go through machines that break the outer structure, separating the husk from the interior. What remains are small pieces, called cocoa nibs. Keep that name, because this is where the chocolate really begins to take shape. The nibs are the pure essence of cocoa, but they're not ready yet. They go through an air separation system. Since the husk is lighter, it's carried away by the airflow, while the heavier nibs remain. Now we have what really matters. And then comes an impressive transformation. The nibs are ground, and the more they are ground, the more they transform, until they become a thick, dark, and liquid paste. Yes, liquid, even without adding anything. This happens because cocoa has about 50% cocoa butter, and with the heat generated by grinding, this natural fat melts. And forms what is called cocoa liquor, or cocoa mass. Now think about this. We're getting closer and closer to the chocolate, but there's still one important step missing. Actually, several. Because this mass still needs to be transformed, refined, and adjusted. And that's where the ingredients that make all the difference come in. Sugar, milk, and more cocoa butter. And what happens next? That's what defines whether the chocolate will be ordinary or simply incredible. Now hold on to this. Up to this point, we already have the cocoa mass. Dark, intense, with a strong flavor and still far from that smooth chocolate you're used to. Then comes the question. What transforms this mass into something sweet, creamy, and irresistible? The answer lies in the mixture. It's at this moment that the ingredients that will define the type of chocolate come in. Sugar, milk powder, and more cocoa butter. All of this is added in extremely calculated proportions. Because any mistake here completely changes the final result. More sugar, sweeter chocolate. More cocoa, more intense chocolate, more butter, softer chocolate. It's all about balance. After mixing, the mass goes through a process called refining. And here something happens that you never noticed, but you feel it every time you eat chocolate. The texture. Machines with giant rollers crush the mixture until the particles become extremely small, smaller than 20 micrometers. To give you an idea, that's smaller than the thickness of a human hair. And that's exactly what makes the chocolate seem to melt in your mouth. Without this process, it would be rough, grainy, not pleasant at all. But hold on, we haven't reached the ideal point yet. Now comes a step that many people have never heard of, but which is responsible for transforming ordinary chocolate into something incredible. Conchying. That this name may sound strange, but the process is simply impressive. The chocolate is placed in large heated tanks, and is continuously mixed for hours. And when I say hours, it's not an exaggeration. It can last from 12 to 72 hours, yes, whole days. And why? Because during this time, the acidity is reduced. The flavors become more balanced, and the texture becomes even smoother. The longer the conking time, the more refined the chocolate will be. Now think about this. The difference between ordinary chocolate and premium chocolate may lie precisely here. In the time, in the patience, in the care. But there's still one final step, a detail that defines whether the chocolate will have that beautiful shine, and that perfect snap when you break it. And this process is more technical than it seems. It's tempering. And this is where science comes into play strongly. Now, we arrive at a decisive moment. After all this process, cultivation, fermentation, roasting, grinding, mixing, and conking, the chocolate is still not ready. There's one detail missing that makes all the difference. Tempering.